Okay, for those of you joining us on the recorded session, welcome to Week 6 Montana Government Studies Seminar. We're going to get underway here. Hello. There we go. All right, so this week's announcements. By the way, we are 25% done with the semester. Mid-quarter grades were stored Monday morning at about 9 a.m. Please bear in mind, mid-quarter is just a snapshot in time. They change. They're only stored for the purposes of doing that little grade report home to your folks. Beyond that, nothing is set in stone. At this point, you can still improve upon your grade by turning in work from this point on. There's nothing you can still submit like late or anything like that. But if you find that your grade is lower than what you would like it to be, now is the time to alter your study habits and make sure that you are turning in absolutely everything, almost without exception. People that are struggling, they're failing the class, it is because either they're not turning things in entirely or they're turning things in incomplete. And I can't give you full credit for things you submit incomplete. I just can't. So make sure you're doing absolutely everything that is being asked of you. Sit down every Monday, and this is just a good rule of thumb for all of your remote classes. All of your remote teachers have their stuff posted by Monday. Usually, like my stuff goes up right away, like 12:01 a.m. Monday. Boom, it's there. But sit down on Monday and make yourself a plan. Divide up the work so that you can accomplish it. Don't just stare these giant things in the face and go, oh my God, how am I going to get this work done? Divide it up. Make yourself a plan. You should now be working on the Unit 2 reading guide. You've had a week on this already. You will have one more full week on this. It is due on the 12th. The end of the grace period is the 17th on that. So if you have yet to start it, make a plan, get it done. Again, shoot for that March 12th date. Don't plan on, oh, I'll submit it the 17th and then, oh my God, I work that day until 8:30. Well, wah, wah. Because at that point you've already had 5 additional days. So make sure you're making that plan. Audio recordings are in the course to help you if you struggle with the readings, or even if you don't necessarily struggle, it wouldn't not always a bad idea to have it playing while you're reading and you're just kind of reading along with it. That would kind of get it in your head, hearing it and also seeing it with your eyes. By the way, those recordings have absolutely everything read. The captions, all the little sidebar things, all of that stuff is read for you on those recordings. So make use of those. It does also have at the end of each chapter, they even read the review questions. Keep in mind, we don't use that exact set of questions, so please don't read to there and go, oh, well, I'll do these and that's what the assignment is. It isn't always. Some of the questions are the same. I did reuse some of them. But other ones, I've changed the focus of the question or I've altered it in some way. So make sure you're using the reading guide as that's the assignment. Don't just do the chapter reviews and say, oh, well, that's what he wants. That's not what I want. So just be sure you're doing the assignments that I've requested you to do and not things that I haven't requested that you do. Make sure you're also working on the ongoing projects, the current event number 2 and the map project or the tour are both due on the 19th, so you still have some time. If you have not yet started those, you still have some time to get those done, but make sure you are making a plan to get those accomplished and get those done. Both of those things have been in the course from the beginning of the semester. Make sure you're doing the week 6 discussion forum. Remember that your thoughtful participation in the discussion forums is worth 15 points every week we have one to your grade. That's something that I've noticed. Again, if folks are struggling, one of the things that more often than not they're just letting go is the discussion forum. They're just, I'm not going to do that. That's points that you are just throwing away if you're not doing those forums every week. Now, I have gotten some messages from folks and they're saying, I'm getting an invalid parameter error when I'm trying to reply. They say that they can post their response to the prompt, create a new discussion, but they cannot then reply to anybody's stuff. Before contacting me with that problem, please look up, Google how to clear the browser cache, CACHE, by the way, for your web browser and operating system. Just do that before, and then try it. And then if it's still not working, give me, shoot me an email, send me a message on Remind. What I will do at that point is I can log in as you. I don't like to do that, but I can. And what I'll do is I will hop on Moodle and log in as you, and I will attempt to post a test message. And all it'll be is I'll just go to the forum and just reply to somebody's thing, and all I'll say is admin test. And then I'll hit post. If it works, then what that means is that what we've done there is we've narrowed down the problem. If it works for me to post that, that means that it's not an issue with your Moodle account, your GFPS Moodle account. Okay, that means that it's an issue likely somewhere between, our servers and your system. So probably either in your Wi-Fi router or in your computer or somewhere in your web browser, there's something going on. Okay, that way you can contact GFPS Help Desk and they can take you through some troubleshooting. Other things that I would try maybe before contacting them, reset your modem, so the thing that brings you internet from the wire outside into your house. And then if you're on Wi-Fi, reset your Wi-Fi router. Just in the case of both, unplug them, wait 30 seconds to a minute, plug them back in. Sometimes that's enough. Sometimes it's just a little hiccup. Restart your computer. Also, try a different web browser. If you usually use Chrome, try it on Firefox. If you're on a Mac and you're using Safari, try it on Chrome, try it on Firefox. If you're on a Windows computer and you're using, for some reason, Internet Explorer, definitely try a different browser. Internet Explorer does not work well with Moodle. They're like oil and water. They just do not mix. Microsoft Edge should be okay because it's based on Chrome. But if you're still using like an older system and Internet Explorer is what you have, please try something else. Almost anything else, really. All web browsers now are free. I remember back in the late Jurassic period where you had to pay like $100 for a web browser. Nowadays, they're all free. So download 2 or 3 of them and always try it. If a problem comes up, try a different browser, see if that solves the issue. Okay, and then we can work from that point. Okay, so yeah, just make sure you're checking on that stuff. Don't just immediately hit the parameter error and you know email me, because all I can do is tell you to reset your browser cache and contact the help desk. That's and I can try that little test post. That's all I can do. So yeah. Make sure you're doing the seminar assignments, week 6 CNN 10 news quiz, week 6 seminar journal. Remember, those are due by Monday morning at 8 a.m. So I give you kind of through the weekend to get on and get those done. But Monday morning, 8 a.m. is when both of those cut off. So make sure to get those done before that. And finally, as usual, please join the Remind. One of the things that I sent out yesterday that if you weren't on the Remind, you didn't know about, was that they took Power School down yesterday starting at 2:30. So from like 2:30 to, I think it was supposed to be 4. I didn't get notice that it was back up till around 5. But they took down Power School for maintenance. I sent that out on the Remind. I did mention it in yesterday's seminar session too, but typically if something like that happens, and oftentimes I don't get notice of that stuff until pretty much when it's happening. I will send it out on the Remind. So if you're not on Remind, you are missing announcements. You can join it. Your parent can join it. If you don't have your own cell phone and your parent does, have your parent join it or join it for them so that you have access to those announcements. Okay. Any questions on any of the announcement type stuff? All right, and again, if you have questions as we're going through things, please unmute yourself and ask. You can put it in the chat too, but realize that I'm not always looking at the chat, so I won't necessarily see it immediately. If you have the means, please just unmute yourself and ask the question. Maybe. There we go. All right, so we're talking about treaties and war between the Native American tribes and the United States in the West in the 1800s, and specifically in Montana. Okay, so treaties. Oh, wait. I cannot see your screen at all. It is completely dark. Oh, never mind. I can see it. Okay, there we go. Good. Again, with those issues, please.
I still can't see your screen.
Okay, let me unshare
I
and
can't see your screen
reshare.
either.
Okay, thank you for letting me know.
It's really blurry.
Well, the picture is, I mean, it's a, let me see here. And that, if it's blurry, that might be your internet connection. There's not much I can do about that, but I'm going to unshare and then reshare, and maybe that will fix the issue.
I can see you now.
All right, is it up for folks?
Yep.
Should say
Yep,
treaties.
it's not blurry anymore.
Okay, hey, there we go. All right.
Yeah, it's good.
All right, good deal. Thank you for letting me know. I love Zoom. I love Zoom. Okay, so treaties, just so we're all clear, are agreements reached, in this case, agreements reached between Native American tribes and the government of the United States. Now, treaties are typically agreements between one government and another government, and that's actually the case in agreements between the United States and Native American tribes. Tribes are governments. However, the United States makes a distinction with Native American tribes. They call them domestic dependent governments because they reside basically within the boundaries of the United States. And so historically, the U.S. government has felt that it's okay to basically violate those treaties, especially back in the 1800s and the early part of the 1900s. Basically violate those treaties whenever they saw fit, because the Native American tribes essentially weren't going to do anything about it, and even if they did, what's the worst they're going to do? was kind of the thinking. We'll talk more about that here in a little bit. So basically, this was a means of awarding the tribes, or sort of specifying that they had rights to the land and they were treated as sovereign entities, or basically the decision makers, or as President George W. Bush might say, the deciders in their particular lands. And treaties were supposed to identify traditional territories for Native Americans and establish reservations. So basically places where the tribe was going to be sovereign-ish. Exchange annuities. An annuity is a cash payment or some kind of structured payment. So basically specifying for period of 10 years, every year the tribe will get $20,000, let's say. So exchange annuities for U.S. government access to lands to build roads and infrastructure kind of things, basically to facilitate westward expansion, and then to maintain peace between Native American tribes, many of whom fought lengthy wars between each other, and also between the tribes and the U.S. government. This was and was not successful. All right, so the first really major agreement that we want to be aware of is the 1851 Indian Appropriation Act, which basically created this reservation system that we sort of think about today with Native American tribes, basically setting aside specific areas of land for Native peoples. And the idea here was essentially to change how Native Americans live their lives. Up to this point, especially in regards to like the Plains tribes, these tribes followed their food source. They followed buffalo. And the reservation system was basically meant to tie these groups, these tribes, to one particular area, which necessitated a fundamental change in their way of life, in what they did. Basically take them from semi-nomadic farmers or semi-nomadic hunters to small-scale virtuous independent farmers like the ones that live in Thomas Jefferson's imagination. So this 1851 Indian Appropriations Act created this reservation system so that basically these tribes would now become farmers. They provided funds to move the tribes onto the reservations. It specified that these tribes could not leave these reservations without permission, or even individual members of those tribes. And also bear in mind that this sort of was the first step in formalizing white settlement in big parts of the West. Okay, so the reality of these treaties and of the reservation systems, the reservations were managed by the U.S. government, and there was no oversight. Basically, the U.S. government called all the shots in the early reservation system. There was no transparency, and it was hugely corrupt. The native peoples were expected to follow these laws that they had no input in making, and that offered very little, if any, protection for them. Basically, it was mostly punitive. And it allowed the gradual ceding of even the lands that had been reserved. It started the process of gradually ceding lots of those lands to white settlers. And you can see on the map here, most Native American reservations are in the west. There are a few little itty-bitty reservations along, the eastern States, but primarily we're talking in the West, because that was where a lot of the eastern tribes were pushed. If they were not completely wiped out, they were pushed into the West. Okay, so the goals here on the part of the United States, the goal was either to assimilate, so basically incorporate Native Americans into overall quote unquote white culture, or, and this is not one that your book necessarily lays out, but honestly, they were just as happy if the Native Americans died. Really and truly. If you look at the policies that were followed after this point, especially the decimation of the bison, they were just as happy if the Native Americans died off. In fact, one of the major military leaders of the U.S. military said that the only good Indian was a dead Indian. So yeah, the ultimate goal of the United States was either to assimilate Native American peoples, or to kill them off so that white society could thrive without any kind of threat. And for the Native American tribes, they wanted desperately to preserve as much of their tradition, as much of their traditional ways of life and traditional lands as they possibly could. Basically, they wanted as little to change as possible, which doesn't so much happen. The other thing to bear in mind is that Native Americans did not have the same concept of land ownership that the United States and white settlers did. For Native Americans, the concept of anyone actually owning land, like I have a deed to this land and it is mine and my sovereign territory, that was really a foreign concept. There were lands that tribes identified as their sort of traditional lands, and they were territorial about them. But the idea that any one person could actually own land, I was sort of like, can you own the earth? Can you own a butterfly? Can you own the eagle? No, it's not really something one gets to own. This is part of the creation and belongs to everyone to a certain degree. And that was just not something that really computed. And so that fundamental difference and that different idea of ownership of land ended up benefiting the white settlers and the government of the United States at the expense of Native American tribes and Native American peoples. Okay, so few problems.
You're frozen. You're frozen.
Uh-oh. Am I frozen to everybody, or?
Yeah, I can't see you either.
Yeah, I can't see you.
Oh my. Okay, let's try unsharing yet again. Am I frozen still?
Now you're not frozen.
Okay.
Not anymore.
I hate my life. All right. Are we back? We good?
Yes, I can see it.
All right. Oy vey. Of course, this is the one I'm recording. All right. So some troubles with treaties. One of the big ones was interpreter errors. All of these treaties between the government of the United States and the Native American tribes were negotiated in English. And most of these tribes, English was not a native language for them. There may be some tribal members that understood English, but in many cases, that was not a thing. So they were reliant upon outside translators. These translators were sometimes not honest. They were sometimes not learned enough to effectively translate into the into the native language, and those errors always benefited the government of the United States. When there was a misunderstanding, it was the white folks that ended up getting the advantage out of it. Also, frankly, the U.S. government would often cherry pick the representatives of the native tribes. Not all tribes had a structure with one guy as the unquestioned leader. Many of these tribes had different bands and different clans that made up the tribe. And so what the government of the US would often do was they would sort of cherry pick one leader who maybe agreed with them more than the other ones, and would choose that person. They would recognize that person as the chief of the tribe. And then they would sign an agreement with that person. Well, maybe that person only represented 10% of the tribe. But that, to the government of the United States, that was an agreement between the entire tribe and the government of the United States. And then you also had political differences in the United States that caused issues. New presidents would completely rewrite treaties. And again, this is where we get into the difference between a treaty between the government of the United States and, say, the government of France, and the government of the United States and a Native American nation, was that the United States did not typically feel that this was a real treaty. Treaties have the force of law as they are written, and to a lot of American politicians of this time, they felt that these were things that they could just kind of rewrite and there would be no consequence to it. So between rewriting of treaties or how they were applied by a new president. I put a picture of Ulysses Grant in there because he actually undid a treaty from the 1850s when he became president, and took away a bunch of lands that had been reserved for Native Americans. And then he himself kind of reversed himself, and then the guy that followed him completely reversed that. So it was like back and forth and back and forth and back and forth, that basically each new president would interpret these things completely differently. There was a communication and transportation lag, so these treaties would be negotiated, and it would take time for the text of those treaties to reach the affected areas after they were approved by the Senate. And by that point, settlers were already there and were already settled. And the U.S. Army was not going to move these white settlers. So already from the get-go, white settlers are violating these treaties, and the U.S. Army is put in this situation where they have to defend these settlers even though they're violating treaties. And the biggest reason this was an issue was that to most white Americans, they did not, at this point of American history, and this goes into the 20th century, it's sad to say, did not view Native Americans as fully human. So to violate a treaty with these groups of people didn't feel like that big a deal, because they did not feel that they were equal to white people. That was very much the attitude of, from presidents to, workers, to average rank and file citizens. The belief was that really these Native Americans were not the same as white people and were not fully human. So 1851, Treaty of Fort Laramie. This is the first Treaty of Fort Laramie. There are at least two of these, two that we're going to discuss. This was the first treaty between the United States and the tribes of what will eventually become Montana. Signed September 17th, 1851, between United States Treaty Commissioners and representatives of the Cheyenne, Sioux, Arapaho, Crow, Assiniboine, Mandan, Hidatsa, and Arikara nations. The biggest thing this did was these tribes agreed not to attack settlers that were going through the area to get to Oregon. Oregon was one of the first draws on the West Coast. Oh, good. It's saying my internet connection is unstable. Just what we need. More tech problems. This was to protect Oregon settlers. It allowed for roads and forts to be built, but the government of the United States at this point was not claiming any of this land. It was understood to be, these were tribal lands, but the U.S. could put forts and build roads and basically transportation infrastructure to facilitate settlers going from the eastern part of the country out to Oregon and then later on California. And the tribes would receive $50,000 for 50 years. Again, this is one of those annuities. A couple years later, the Hellgate Treaty of 1855, signed between the territorial governor of Washington. So Montana was a part of the Washington Territory for a good chunk of time. Then it was part of the Idaho Territory, and then it'll be its own territory of Montana. But this guy's name was Isaac Stevens, and representatives of the tribes that we sort of recognize as the Flathead tribes today, the Salish, the Pend Oreille, and the Kootenai tribes, they relinquished almost all of their territories in what will become Montana, including like huge swaths of the Bitterroot Mountains and basically everything around Missoula. Relinquished that for $120,000. It established the Flathead Reservation, not quite the Flathead Reservation that we know today, but close. And one of the observers of the negotiations was a Jesuit priest. Said that the translations were so poor that not a tenth of what was said was understood by either side. But again, those translation difficulties always benefited the government of the United States. And one of the things that was not understood was they signed away way more land than they had intended to sign away. And then the same year, Lame Bull's Treaty, negotiated again by Isaac Stevens. Stevens was also, in addition to being the territorial governor of the Washington Territory, was also the basically superintendent of Indian affairs for this region, which is why he was the guy negotiating these treaties. He goes on to be a kind of a major Civil War figure. But this was negotiated between Stevens and representatives of the Blackfeet tribe, also there, the Nez Perce, the Salish, the Pend Oreille. This set aside a common hunting ground for a period of 99 years for all of those tribes to use, identified land for a Blackfeet reservation, and all of those tribes would be paid $20,000 a year for 10 years. Again, one of those annuity type things. But what this ended up doing was, because those common hunting grounds were not reservation lands, it enabled white settlers to move into that area. And so pretty soon those common hunting grounds were no longer available for hunting, because the white settlers moved in and put up fences and started raising cattle and things like that. And the buffalo could no longer roam down there. So there was no home where the buffalo roam. The deer and the antelope play. 1868, the Second Treaty of Fort Laramie. This was renegotiated after the events of the Bloody Bozeman, which we won't get into here, but just in a nutshell, this was one of the routes west to get to California as well as to the gold fields of Montana. And some of the native tribes began attacking miners that were coming through this area along what was called the Bozeman Trail. This became known as the Bloody Bozeman. I recommend you, this is in Chapter 7. I would recommend reading up on that. So ultimately, what happens here is the Treaty of Fort Laramie will end up creating what becomes known as the Great Sioux Reservation, which was basically half of what will become South Dakota. eventually. And then that's everything within South Dakota on that map was the Great Sioux Reservation. Everything outside of that was termed unceded Indian lands. And those should have been a part of that reservation, but weren't technically. And so white settlers went right in there and pretty soon start chipping away at that reservation. But these were set aside until the bison were gone. That was one of the reasons why the government of the United States really threw their backs into basically wiping out the bison so that they could get their hands on more and more land. Created agencies around the area to oversee the distribution of supplies and continual education and assimilation of the native populations. That was a big thing for white America. Was they wanted to, if they couldn't kill off the natives, they wanted to educate them. And basically one of the sayings from a general was, kill the Indian and save the man, was the idea. And also this created the Crow Reservation in Montana. So problems will continue as the effort is made to herd more and more native peoples onto reservations. Some of these tribes will try and fight back because some of these treaties were just negotiated completely unfairly, or they didn't want to sign treaties, they didn't want to give up their traditional ways of life. So there was, again, this armed conflict between tribes and settlers, and then between tribes and the government of the United States and the U.S. military. The U.S. military encourages the wholesale slaughter of the primary food source of the Plains tribes, the bison. By the time we get to the 20th century, the Smithsonian had trouble finding 20 good specimens of bison. And that was from, I mean, there at one time were millions of bison on the Great Plains. So they literally will just pay people to kill them dead. So there were some tribal victories like Little Bighorn, which you might know as Custer's Last Stand. But those were always followed by retribution by the U.S. government. In this case, the massacre at Wounded Knee, where the U.S. military, Custer's the soldiers that were left from the ones that Custer served with, attacked a group of mostly unarmed Native Americans and absolutely slaughtered them and left the bodies out during a snowstorm. That's the picture you see there is a victim of that. But so eventually these tribes are basically forced to give up and accept life on reservations, and tribal leaders like Sitting Bull and Crazy Horse are ultimately killed because of their involvement in these uprisings. So yeah, eventually these treaties are sort of whittled down, and these reservations are whittled down as more and more white settlers come into the area until we have the reservations that we have today. Recently, there has been more of a judicial effort to interpret these treaties in such a way that they actually benefit Native American tribes and sort of hold the U.S. government to the word that they negotiated in these treaties, but overall the damage has largely been done in these cases. So anyway, so your journal topic for this week: why were treaties pursued between the U.S. government and native tribes in the West, and what were some of the problems with those treaties? So please write your response to that in the Week 6 seminar journal assignment on Moodle. Are there any questions about anything that we discussed today? And I apologize for all the technical issues. I am going to escape out of this, but I'm going to keep that journal topic up there. It's just going to be, oh, there we go. It's just going to be on that screen. If there are no questions, I'm going to let you be free. I'll leave this up for a minute if you need that to copy down. But if you have something you need to discuss with me, hang out and we'll talk about it. All right, thanks everybody. Goodbye.
Have a good day.
You too. And then there were 3. I'm going to go ahead and stop the recording, maybe, if I can figure out how to do that. Stop